So welcome back to my channel. This is Dom, and today a little bit different. I've been asked a few times in the past on the stream, on the Plastic Crack podcast stream, and also through video comments about how I go about different projects and you know, kind of the process I start with when I'm working on a new project. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been doing a lot. I mean, to be honest, I found myself going down a rabbit hole of YouTube videos. Actually, I think it was History Hits TV. I saw a series of 2 videos about a period of history that I knew nothing about. Now, I'm not saying I'm all-knowing about everything that happened in history. Far from it. I did study history at university. But my knowledge of history is very much limited to Western Europe, and particularly to the British Isles, I guess. You know, I have a good knowledge of elsewhere, but the fact I found about a war that I'd never heard of before, or at least never been terribly conscious of before anyway, because as it turned out I did know about it, but was kind of a bit eye-opening to me. So anyway, long story short, what I'm talking about is a fascinating invasion of Ireland by Robert the Bruce in the years after Bannockburn. So Bannockburn, the classic Scottish victory against Edward, when the Scots overturned a massive deficit in terms of men, heavily outnumbered, to beat the English in 1314. And after Bannockburn, the Robert Bruce recognised that the resources of England were such that they would inevitably come knocking again. And so he went on the offensive. He invaded northern England and sent an army of many of the veterans of Bannockburn and other mercenary troops down south, and laid waste to huge areas of the north of England, captured cities, captured castles, generally made an absolute nuisance of himself. And I knew that, and I'd read about that, and I was well aware of that. But what I wasn't terribly aware of was at the same time he sent his brother Edward into Ireland with a similar force. And he recognised, probably rightly, that Ireland was crucial to the English king because a lot of the food, particularly grain, came from Ireland, and he needed to open up that other front to basically put pressure on the English to negotiate and recognise Scotland as an independent country. And it was just like, wow, what a fantastic scenario for a campaign. Now, I've always been somewhat interested by Irish history as well, because I think it's always treated in the histories as a fairly backward country through the medieval, Dark Age and medieval times, but actually it was fascinating what was going on there. And in some ways it was a little bit of a throwback. You had very much more feudalism going on. You had English lords, or English is a bit of a misnomer, because really they were Norman lords who took over huge swathes of Ireland, enslaved effectively the population, and ruled as barons and earls of Ireland. So when the Scottish force arrived, about 10,000 men I believe, including, as I say, a number of veterans from Bannockburn, it was a bit of a shock. And a number of Irish lords looked at the Scots as an opportunity. And in fact, Edward was named High King of Ireland. He was the last High King of Ireland. That was the sort of... There were a number of different kings around Ireland, and the High King was the one to rule them all, as somebody would say. Anyway, the war in Ireland went on for 3 years, and the Scots had a number of victories. They had a lot of Irish come to swell their ranks, lords who threw their lot in with the Bruces, Robert was there for a short while, but mainly left the fighting to his brother. I say, went on for 3 years. They got down to Dublin, which was the centre of English or Anglo-Irish operations, administration, but didn't have a siege engine to take the city and withdrew. Now, in some ways, they had a lot of bad luck because their invasion of Ireland coincided with a Europe-wide famine, and famine that particularly hit Ireland and caused huge heartache and a lot of death. And it caused a lot of problems for the Scots to resupply. And they bit off more than they could chew, in all honesty. And eventually they were defeated. But after 3 years and successive victories against the individual English lords and even some of the Irish lords, and eventually, because of the famine, a lot of the Irish turned away from the Scots, and eventually they were defeated and Edward was killed. And that was the end of it. He was the last High King of Ireland. There was never another one. And that was the end of that adventure. But it gives a really good backdrop to a project, and it particularly gives me a backdrop because I had a number of Baron War figures that I bought from Footsore during their Kickstarter things, and I painted a load of them up, but I got a load more that I just haven't got around to using. And really I was sort of struggling because although I've got the Baron Wars rules, I haven't played them, and I'm not that bothered really, if I'm honest. I wanted to play a big mass battle game. Because although Baron Wars is obviously set in the Baron Wars, there's not a huge time difference. I mean, it's about 50 years or so. The second Baron Wars finished around 1267, and obviously Bannockburn was 1314. So, there was a certain... There wasn't that much had changed. Certainly not when you compare it to the next 50-odd years. When you head into the 100 Years' War, which was 1337 or so, started there, you've got again a little bit of similarity. So it sort of sits between the Baron Wars and the 100 Years' War, which means figures are kind of relatively easy to use as long as you use knights that are predominantly male. I don't mean sex, I mean chainmail armed or chainmail defending, and infantry tend to be wearing things like kettle helmets and more open-faced helmets. So I think the point is the figures are pretty much good and fit pretty well. There's also a number of figure manufacturers who do Irish figures, who do Gilgal and various other figures, and actually some of those fit perfectly into this period. So it kind of gave me a perfect excuse, and I went down the rabbit warren of even looking into medieval armour books and finding out the difference between the different periods and when the different armour came in, which I find fascinating. I'm not a purist at all by any means, but I didn't want to have figures that obviously were sort of 100-Year War, later 100-Year War, or even War of the Roses in the period when it clearly wasn't appropriate. So I also looked at videos, but also these medieval warfare magazines are fantastic. They are really high quality historical research. Here you go. There's a story about the history of the Irish Axeman. Got a bit of a headache, that chap. These sort of things written by archaeologists and historians. Really good background. I thoroughly recommend if you're interested. And you can buy back copies if they're fully indexed on their website, and so you can get back packets. Here you go. The Scottish invasion of England in 1138. Again, a bit earlier, but it also a very interesting article about professional warriors in Ireland. And as I say, it's very easy to start reading up on all this stuff and start to be familiar with the period. This was a book I had in my collection, The Scottish and Welsh Wars, 1250 to 1400. Again, in that same period that we're talking about. Lots of illustrations. These are very much Osprey-type pictures. and some interesting stories about the period itself, tactics used, and also kind of arms and armour. Showed this already. The Bannockburn Osprey book, again, gives you very good, gives a really good insight into the period, the kind of armour worn, kind of weaponry used, etc., etc., which is great. Another book I've picked up, the Scottish and Welsh Wars. I think that is that the same book? You know what that is, exactly the same book. It's just been rebranded. Anyway, you can see the point. So lots and lots of research and reading. But you know, the funny thing was, the book that's inspired me most around army composition is this one. Now, it's funny, on the Plastic Crack the other week, Ken was talking about retro gaming from the 80s and the 90s, which was quite amusing because I don't think he remembers that period. But this is a very old set of army lists from the Wargames Research Group, November 1982. I was 16 when that came out. And I used to play 7th edition, as this is. 6th or 7th edition, I forget now. It's written by Phil Barker. I used to play a lot of this, and also used to spend hours building armies, because it had army building lists. You can see here I've got them all colour schemed out and everything, and mainly played 15mm, to be honest, in this time, because I didn't have the money to do anything else, and you know, that's just what I played, and I really enjoyed it. But in here is a couple of army lists that are exactly in the right period. Here we go. Medieval Irish, 1300 AD to 1487, so right in our period. So this would do really well for either, for, I guess, if I'm going to do just a purely Irish army, and you can see that, well, I don't know whether you can read it, but it talks through the composition and gives you the percentages of what you're allowed to have depending on the period you're fighting. And these books are really well researched. They're very, very well researched, but it gives you a composition of the type of, you can have, well, in this one you could have Scottish knights. Obviously that's not going to be appropriate for this, but if I'm playing this as Anglo-Irish, I can have English in there, Irish horsemen, they were light cavalry, javelin, Gilligal, which are basically there were two types of mercenaries predominantly used in this period. There were the Gilgals, who were the Scottish, predominantly Scottish ancestry. They were heavy armed men in full mail shirts, generally wielding axes. And then the Boniacs, who were sort of an Irish version of that. They were Irish professional soldiers. Given Ireland was a very poor country, a lot of their soldiers were mercenaries. They moved around offering their services for hire. And it was quite a brutal system, actually, because any mercenary could just basically plunder what it wanted, what they wanted, and that was the way they made their living. In fact, most of the Gilgal and also the Boniacs were actually Irish by this period, but anyway. So and then the Kerns, which were the bulk of any Irish army of the period, who were lightly armed, predominantly javelin, few archers, and so forth. So it gives me a sort of foundation of what I can use. Here is a Anglo-Irish army, which again I think, so my theory is I'm going to do a force that matches the Anglo-Irish. I'm going to do troops that could be used in purely an Irish army, and then the Scottish Irish army. So again, this gives you a nice breakdown of what the troop types existed in the period. So for our period, which is what is it? This goes from 1172 to 1483. So it's kind of the middle, early period. So I just need to select what I want. So I got the knights, or the Anglo-Irish lancers, who were heavy cavalry, could be upgraded to extra heavy knights. So they were male. So basically, extra heavy knights in this system are male wearing knights, heavy cavalry with just sort of leather and heavy kind of protection, but not all the way up to plate, which in this book is super heavy knight, which is these fellas, but that's for the middle and late period, so they wouldn't actually be in existence in this period. You've got the judiciary men-at-arms, you've got the hobiliers, which are very much part of every army of this period anyway. You had spearmen, archers, longbowmen. But what's good is, unlike the later period where archery and longbows dominated the battlefield, in Ireland they didn't have that many. And you can see in this army list, you're in quite a few actually. In the later period, 24 to 32 figures, whereas on the early one you're in 48 to 96. Seems a bit high to me because, again, from what I've read, longbow wasn't that much of a factor. So I'm going to basically limit myself probably to one unit of longbow in the English army. And then billmen, and you've got the Gilgal and Boniacs and the Kerns that all filled out this army. So that's the English. Well, the English-Irish, and then you've got the Scottish Common Army. So this one is based around the Bannockburn and later battles, but also within it is an option for the invasion of Ireland. This is where I say that I did actually know about this, because it is actually written in here about invasion of Ireland. So anyway. But again, you can see the different troop compositions. Obviously, the Scottish Army is predominantly based around spearmen. But I think I'm mainly going to use that Irish army that I showed you earlier and the Anglo-Irish, and build out two forces that I can use using Hail Caesar. I think I'm going to go with Hail Caesar because I think it gives a good game. And I'm going to take inspiration from some of the stats and things that Martin, Seventh Son, has done for his later period Hail Caesar rules, because I think they give a really good fun game, and that's what I'm looking for. So there you go, bit of retro. Phil Barker, fantastic. Yeah, lovely old book. Never throw anything away, eh? So over here you can see all my figures. These are, I've been sorting them through. These are all the Baron War figures, as you can see. There are knights there that are pretty much the right period. You can see they're predominantly male, wearing their horses have got some sort of barding on them, but not much. Dismounted figures and what have you. Some sergeants there, mounted sergeants who've got the right kind of kettle helmets on, which is the right period. I've also got there's a number of infantry here. Again, pretty much the right period. They've got padded gabions on, which is right. These are some Welsh figures, so I can push them in. I could either use them as mercenary unit or just put them in the infantry blocks. Not sure yet, but I'm just working my way through. Some crossbowmen. Now, crossbowmen, again, there's not really talked about hugely, but it was a weapon of the period, so I'm going to have a couple of units of crossbows in there. So anyway, I've also made a start. Showed this on the plastic crack. This is part of the light infantry archers that I'm building out, and this was kind of testing it out. I wanted them to be dark and dingy, which they certainly are. And these are a mixture. These are actually some peasant figures from Conquest games mixed in with the footsore ones. You can see they mix really well. You can't really tell the difference. Now, I happen to know that guy is one of the Conquest game figures, and this one is definitely one of the footsore ones. So yeah, they fit in beautifully. So I'm going to have a couple of units of light infantry bowmen, which that's the first one. I'm going to put them on these muddy group bases, and that'll be an element. That's Friar Tuck. Keep chucking them around. So anyway, there you go. That's what I'm working on. That's what I'm going to go through in the next few weeks and months. We'll see how long it takes, but my plan is to build out as I say, an Anglo-Scottish army and then an Anglo-English army. I'll get that right. So my plan is to build a Scottish Irish army and a Anglo-Irish army, and using Hail Caesar, and we'll see where we go with that. Now, in terms of the Kerns, I've gone for the Wargames Atlantic plastic Dark Age Irish Warriors, and the reason I've done that, there we go, I bought a couple of boxes of these. So the reason I've done that is because they're quite cheap. You get 40 models in the box, but they're all pretty much nondescript. Again, looking at the pictures and reading the descriptions, the Irish Kerns and the Irish sort of folk didn't change hugely from the Dark Age period through to the High Medieval period in terms of what they wore. And the Kerns particularly so, because they were the poorest of the poor. So I think I could get away with it and put in a few other, maybe a couple of figures, metal figures in there as well, just to bulk them out and just to add a bit of variety. I'm not sure there's much call for war dogs, but whatever. So that's what I'm going to be doing, and I think they should work quite nicely. So I've got 2 boxes of those, which was an affordable way to do it, and I've got some other assorted Irish figures coming down from various manufacturers just to sort of fit in. The Gaelgals and the Scottish mercenary troops are the ones that are slightly more difficult to get. I think I'm going to have to buy those in because they do look somewhat different. So I was going to use some of the Victrix Norman plastics for some of those axe wielding guys, but there's 2 problems there. One, they don't come with a huge number of axes in the packs, and they tend to be double-handed axes that these guys used, and the Victrix packs don't have them. And B, I've got a number of sort of appropriate looking heads from the Perry War of the Roses archer sets, but they're too small for the bodies of the Victrix, and they just look really, really odd. So I'm not sure I'm going to get away. I might just put a couple of them into units, the ones that are more or less obviously Norman, because the one thing that is very clear from reading all the stuff is that largely the Norman helmet with the sort of nose guard had passed out of use, and troops tend to use the kettle helmets or open-faced helmets. And so having ones with nose guards is just not going to work. So, and also cavalry is another problem area. Apart from the knights and a few sergeants I've got in these footsore ones, sort of the Hobiliers and Irish cavalry are a little bit more problematic, so they'll probably have to be bought in. Anyway, there you go. So that's people asked, so I'm showing you how I'm going about this, what I'm doing. I'll take you through some of the units as I build them. So when I work my way through these piles of metal here, and I'm starting to just break them into units. Now I've got that composition of what I want. What I'm going to do is flesh out the actual unit structures based around that book, the Army List book here. I'm going to actually sort of, lap out that I'm going to have 1 unit of bowmen, 1 unit of longbowmen, some billmen, blah de blah de blah, and then I can start to fit the troops to it. And then hopefully by the time the sort of first phase is done, if I switch between English or Anglo-Irish and Scottish-Irish, I should have enough troops to at least play a game early on and see how it goes. So there you go. I thought you might be interested in that. I hope you enjoy the journey as I go through this. And any suggestions and other reading material. When I talked about it on the Plastic Crack the other Monday night, I got some really good suggestions for a couple of a book that I hadn't realised covered that period, and also another video series that I wasn't aware of. So any suggestions on if anybody else is more au fait with this period than I was, and particularly of the Irish campaign, I would love to be pointed in the right direction. Anyway, there you go. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe. Hope your projects are going well. And I will see you again soon. This is Dom, signing out.